right. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Eisengruber. I'm the Vice President of Customer Strategy at Fairy Godboss. For those of you who might not be aware yet, Fairy Godboss is the largest career community for women. Our mission is to improve the workplace for women by increasing transparency, and we offer a variety of free resources like anonymous company reviews, job listings, articles, and more to help women succeed in their careers. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items for today. We will be taking questions at the end of this webinar. You can ask them as yourself or anonymously using the Q&A feature at the bottom bar of your screen. The webinar is also being recorded and will be sent out as a follow-up, so please feel free to rewatch anything you may have missed and share with your networks. Now, I'd love to kick things off by thanking our sponsor for today's conversation, Terra Health Foundation. Here to share a little bit more about this collaboration is Jen Stark, Senior Director of Corporate Strategy at Terra Health. Jen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I had a boss who once told me, when you don't know how much authority you have, take it. And I know women's ERGs do this every day in countless ways. You're organizing for things like pay equity, finding ways to show up as allies in racial equity and LGBTQ inclusion, and helping your companies understand the outsized role they have when it comes to public policy. On behalf of the Terra Health Foundation, we're so glad to have found an organization like Fairy Godboss to support and to build more muscle within companies and across industries to mobilize women's ERGs like never before. Gender equity in the workplace is long overdue and has too many benefits to even name. And this work fits squarely with the goals of Terra Health Foundation to improve the lives of women and girls in the United States. So today is the first webinar of several we're underwriting to help women's ERGs dig into hot topics from the inside out. And while we don't want you to feel like you have to wait for instructions, we also want to honor that it can seem overwhelming sometimes when issues are complex and our individual roles can feel small in comparison. So despite how tired we are, I hope you leave today fired up and that you know what matters, that you begin to ask questions within your workplaces, identify allies, partner with outside groups like the ones featured on our call, and yes, even raise a little bit of hell, because if not now, when? So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jen. So here to talk to us more today about leveraging your ERG as a force for change, I'm joined by Erica, Annie, and Sharon. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Erica, why don't we just kick everything off with some introductions? And I'd love for you, as you're introducing yourself, to also share an example of how you've seen corporate support and employee support make a difference on issues that you care about. So Erica, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Annie, and then we'll follow up with Sharon.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon for me. I'm joining from Baltimore, Maryland. So Erica Seth Davies, I am the CEO of Reinventures, where we are on a mission to transform the women's reproductive, sexual, and maternal health market to ensure that it is vibrant and inclusive for all women and birthing people. Our engagement here today is as an advocate, as an investor, and as a provider of technical assistance for companies that are in that market. But I am happy to talk about some of the ways in which I've seen employee engagement in particular transform corporate movement and advocacy on particular issues. And I think we all saw it happen in 2020 around racial justice and racial reckoning that was happening. So we've been here in the past where there's been unrest, there has been protests in the past, but I think this time there was a lot more engagement from employees who actually had expectations of their corporations, of their employers to take a stand and make statements on what was happening all around us. And so I think that had a lot to do with some of the statements that we were seeing emerging from companies last year and continuing to emerge from companies. But what's even more important is that those voices are actually demanding accountability now for some of those statements. So I think that was a really important turning point for employee engagement and corporate policy and practice as it pertains to racial justice that, again, I think we've all seen unfold over the last year, almost 2 years now.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Erica, and thanks for joining us. Annie, I'd love to kick it over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am so glad to be here with you all this morning. I'm Annie Sarter. I lead the business partnerships work at Plus Paid Leave for the US. Plus is an organization that is working to win a permanent, comprehensive, federal paid family and medical leave program for everyone in the United States, so we can all be there with our families when we are needed most. We've been in the news lately. Paid leave was cut 2 weeks ago, a week ago, from the president's Build Back Better budget reconciliation package. It was in the news. We got a lot of attention. And one of the incredibly powerful things that I saw, and a good example, I think, to share this morning, is we worked with companies, large and small, brands across the country to generate over 150 emails from people across the country to members of Congress, urging them to prioritize paid leave. A lot of these companies did this action, shared this action with their constituents because an ERG was advocating for the company to take action on paid leave and demonstrate commitment where they say there is commitment. And as of yesterday, paid leave is back in the Build Back Better package. It's an uphill battle for what comes next, and there's a lot of fight to do. So we'll need those companies and ERGs to continue to push. But it's been exciting to see the outcry, and big thanks to everyone, maybe some who are on the line here who helped.
Thanks so much, Annie, and congratulations. We know that you've been fighting the fight. And Sharon, we'll kick it over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And again, thank you for the invitation. Thrilled to be here. So I'm Sharon Graham. I'm with Gilead Sciences. And, at Gilead, we have 6 ERGs, Women at Gilead being one of them, all run by an army of volunteers. But I'm in a very fortunate position where I'm a full-time dedicated headcount to our women's ERG at Gilead since April of this year. So, one of the things that if I think about kind of where employee support makes a difference, I think it's really important to have like a safe space, but also a brave space for people to have open and transparent kind of discussions around what the issues at hand are. And I think it's really where I've seen it being most impactful is, and I love what Annie was saying, is like whenever you can create volume of data, whether that's through surveys, emails, whatever it is, you can actually be more of a powerful champion for a solution versus, oh, we'd like this, or we've heard that somebody, a couple of people would like that. If you can put data behind it, I think with enough data and rationale, we can definitely be champions for change. And I think from a corporate standpoint, I'll speak for Gilead. I think having leadership that listens and, pays attention to not just the data, but the rationale and the impact, I think is really important. So I know we're going to talk more about that later.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sharon. So before we dive into kind of putting strategy into action, which I think is what a lot of the people tuning in today are here for, it's important to note that this work really takes a village, and sometimes it takes a village years, right? So that being said, we're on this precipice of potentially passing the National Family Paid Leave Act and Medical Leave Program, which Annie, you had mentioned. So to give that conversation just a little more context for those who might not be familiar, Annie, can you share a little bit more about how Plus worked with ERGs and companies to really get to this point? And what can the ERGs do now to help further it? You mentioned we still have a long road ahead.
Yes, of course. So Plus was founded back in 2016 to win a paid family and medical leave program. It was before the election in 2016 when we started, and it was a completely different political and legislative world. We didn't know what was coming. And it was a really radical notion that especially perhaps a low wage working person should have access to any kind of paid leave. It was, just a few short years ago, access to time to be with one's family, to welcome a new child, to care for a seriously ill family member, to care for one's own serious illness, was even more so than now an elite benefit, reserved for the most highly paid working people in this country. And so when we founded, we really began by looking to employers to expand their paid leave programs, to develop some narrative around what paid leave is, what it looks like when you have it, what it looks like when you don't have it, and to open up some of that political space so that we can be sitting in the legislative moment that we're sitting in right now. So we spent a long time talking to employers about their paid leave programs, and we quickly realized that what we needed to do would be to essentially become a consulting firm and help companies create a better paid leave program, one that had adequate length, one that was equal to not all employees, didn't just serve people in a corporate office, but in fact offer benefits to everyone at a particular company. And we offered that as a training. And ERGs were, and still are in many ways, the entry point, or the beginning point for us to help work with companies to develop a better program. We found, I'm in Oakland, California, Plus was founded in the Bay Area. So we began by working with a lot of tech companies that had parents ERGs or women's ERGs that were fired up about this issue, saw paid leave as a cutting edge issue for working parents, and worked with us to establish a better program within their company. And that was smart of us in retrospect, because as the political space began to open and we started talking about what a federal paid leave policy could actually look like, those were the people and the institutions that were then poised to take the existing program that they had put into place and say, you know what, actually, we support a federal program. And to take that sort of internal work and focus it to ensuring that everyone in this country has access to the benefit. Because paid leave happens at workplaces, people take leave from their workplace. Congress is very sensitive to this. Members of Congress don't want to support a bill that doesn't work for the business community. So having companies that have paid leave policies in place, they can speak from the experience of having a program that works. It hasn't sunk the economy, it hasn't sunk their business, and then be able to go on record publicly has been a critical piece of moving forward the legislative possibility, we will say. And they remain a force. I was on a call with the company last week where they had organized their ERG members to take action by calling members of Congress. And so it's shifted from putting a paid leave policy in place. A lot of these companies have already done that by now. So now they can take it a step further and mobilize their employees to engage. So we have a little link. I don't know if we can share it, but it's, I think, paidleave.us/email your MOC. There's some underscores in there. Hopefully we can get it in the chat or somewhere. But it really, it feels silly to email your senator. I realize that. But on an issue like this that is really on the knife edge of being cut or being kept in a policy, every message into a Senate office really is helping, and it helps for individuals to share, and it really helps when ERGs can organize themselves to mobilize a base of employees to take action.
Great. And Rachel actually from Fairy Godboss just dropped it into the chat. So it's paidleave.us/email-your-moc. Use that link to go on and send an email to your senator to let them know that this is an important topic for you. Thank you so much, Annie, for the context too, because I think, at least in my experience, you did something like paid leave doesn't become really important to you until you're experiencing it or not, and until you don't have that opportunity. And so I commend the work that you're doing, and excited to have our audience get more involved as well. So everybody on this call was involved in the creation of an ERG toolkit on how ERGs can advance gender equality. We'll also link that in the chat as well, but we'll share it after the conversation. And in this toolkit, we discuss kind of key objections that businesses can usually have. Things like, my company doesn't get involved in politics, or it's not the company's responsibility, or corporate advocacy isn't great for business. Once ERGs have decided what issues to get involved in, how do you really recommend overcoming these objections? And Erica, we'll start with you, and then we'll switch to Annie as well.
Sure. So when you hear that, when I hear those objections, it really is a little hard not to laugh in the face of those, because there's so much evidence that companies do in fact get involved in politics and policy. I mean, most of the time there's at least a high level position or even a team of people that are dedicated to government relations. There's lobbying, there are political contributions, and then a ton of informal conversations with lawmakers or other policy influencers. So that's just not the case. That the companies are not involved in policy and in politics. And so as you kind of highlight some of this, and move to push back on that idea that we just don't get involved. We try not to get involved in these things. You can start to see it's not whether or not they want to be involved, but it's really what are the priorities that they're raising to the top of the list, or what are the specific areas or issues that they are choosing to get involved in. So these are choices. It's not simply, oh, we're a company, we don't get involved. And then, as it's very often the case, that oh well, if we do make political contributions, we try to be bipartisan. Or because we give to both parties, we're not necessarily implying an endorsement of a politician's position or every single position. But again, back to the issue of what are the issues that are being supported by politicians. There's damage that can be done when the message isn't sent that we're not supportive of a policy that is going to actually actively bring harm to women and birthing people, for example, or bring damage to families, or mitigate some of the diversity that we actually see in the workforce. So like these policies have consequences. So I'm pointing out that it's not, all things are not equal. And so being very clear about what some of the decisions to support both sides can actually mean in the lives of people who are like moving the business forward simply as employees. And then finally, making the business case actually for companies to get involved in issues, and showing as we were saying before, I think it was Sharon that was talking about using data, right? Like, and making the quantitative case as much as the qualitative case for why these policies and positions actually matter. So at Reinventures, we've produced 2 business cases, one called Hidden Value, the business case for reproductive health, and From Here to Maternity, the business case for strong maternal health care benefits in the corporate sector, both of which lay out quite clearly what the benefits are to the bottom line of businesses when they are advancing these policies, and thinking intentionally about who's in their workforce and who they want to be in their workforce and even in their leadership ranks. And so you can supplement, whatever data you can find within your actual company or in your sector that's relevant to ensuring that these policies are in place, are all ways of pushing back on that idea that we just don't get involved in things like this.
I love that. And Annie, anything additional to add on how to kind of overcome some of those objections if my company doesn't get involved in these political matters?
I think everything Erica said resonates with me, especially I'll underline the point that Erica, you made about companies saying they don't get involved. Large companies, yes, they do. They have a lobbying firm in DC. They are involved. And speaking among friends here at the Fairy God Boss webinar, I think, again, to sort of underline what Erica is saying is it's easy to sort of hand wave and stay on sort of the moralistic arguments, and the moral arguments are true and correct. And for businesses to take action, they need to see like where it pencils out on the budget spreadsheet. So really making the business case, not waving away an objection, but actually looking at it like, okay, what would this actually cost? Like, what are we really talking about for companies? And not simply dismissing that is, I think, essential to really make a serious counter argument when they want to just sit on the sidelines, to really dig in on it and look under the hood of an issue for the business case.
And you both mentioned building a business case and a strong business case at that. I think one of the things that we often hear at Fairy God Boss when we're talking to ERG leaders is this might be their first time leading an ERG, and this is all volunteer work in many cases. Sharon's case is very unique. So how do you go about building a business case, and what kind of data or resources should they be looking for or looking to? So any tactics that you can share, and like I mentioned, the more tactical the better, because I think a lot of people on this call are in a position where this is their +1 job, and they want to be effective and they want to be helpful, but they really don't know where to start. So Erica, we'll start with you, and then Sharon, also would love to come to you and hear kind of your practical experience on it.
Sure. So in terms of our business case for reproductive health hidden value, we actually identified 5 major reasons why companies should offer the best and most comprehensive reproductive health care to their employees, and why they should be advocating for public policies that would benefit all of their workers as well. So we were looking at widening the workforce pipeline and actually attracting talent to support and retain existing talent. We know that it's expensive, right? Turnover is very expensive to companies. These benefits are actually cost effective and high impact, and have health equity, health benefits for talent. It's an additional way of delivering on DEI goals, which again are becoming increasingly important and central to the ways that companies deliver on their value. And to get ahead of the curve, actually, as stakeholders. And so we're seeing a much more active investor community as well as consumer base. And so when you're being as thoughtful and intentional about these policies as possible, you can get ahead of the curve and actually establish yourself as a leader in your market when it comes to addressing some of these issues. And so again, we were using labor statistics and demographic statistics, surveys of employee and consumer attitudes, and quite frankly, some of the expectations that people have at this point of how companies are treating all of their workers, and women in particular, and what are some of the existing cost benefit analysis work that is out here. So, leveraging reports like ours, I'm looking to Fairy God Boss for additional resources like the toolkit, which links to a number of additional resources. And I think, again, being intentional about focusing on the composition of the workforce as it relates to the demographics of our society. So if you want to create a workplace that is going to attract and retain diverse talent, then you have to think about and address the needs of your diverse talent. And this even gives a way of thinking about it at an intersectional level. So the intersections of race and gender, or race and gender and disability and LGBTQI status. So there's a number of ways that we can be much more intentional and advancing some of the business case for this work. So that's from an external lens. And then where available, looking to some of your company's internal data. What is it looking like in terms of morale or retention or recruitment? What are some of the internal challenges that are coming up, and how can you lift these types of policies up as ways of addressing and resolving some of those challenges that do exist? So if you're finding it hard to recruit talent in particular locations, you might be in a location or, you know, supporting policies that are not attractive to the talent pipeline. If it's women aren't returning to work after giving birth, what about your company is not making that much easier or feasible for women? So is it childcare? Is it, you know, supportive insurance policies that are, you know, providing, you know, doula or covering doulas, or yeah, you get the idea. There's a lot of different interventions and ways that we can be looking at it. So
definitely. And Rachel again added to the chat the links to some of the resources that Erica mentioned. So if you're interested, make sure you're looking into the chat. And again, we have the Q&A function. I see questions coming in. We'll hold them to the end, but we will ask your questions. So Sharon, I wanted to switch to you. And you know, you're in a very unique position. You mentioned at the beginning, 6 months new to your role as the head of the women's ERG at Gilead Science. So talk to us a little bit about your experience with the ERG work. And I think really what our audience is looking for is more information or tactics that helped you get buy-in and practically really build the business case, whether that's for your role or for some of the different issues that your ERG is getting involved in specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And you know, I think this bridges really nicely from everything Erica was just saying. Wherever data you can kind of put behind things. And I mentioned data earlier, and it's kind of going to be a theme throughout today's discussion. I think you should always, you know, I will say when I first kind of took this role, one of the most exciting things about the role was the fact that it was a little bit of a blank slate in terms of what the role would involve, what it would look like, what success would look like. That also made it the most daunting piece of, so it's kind of like it made it the most exciting, but also the most daunting. But I think, you know, starting off, I did a deep situational analysis on looking at all the initiatives that had been done by the ERG, all the survey results at the end. There were some really positive things in there, just talked to a lot of people, did a lot of focus groups. And because I think the most important thing you can do when you're thinking about starting, you know, presenting or creating a business case is, first of all, start with what you're trying to solve for. And so you're going to need data to back why that's important to solve for. So in our case at Gilead, when I looked at this year's employee engagement survey plus the prior one from 2 years ago, the only area of the employee engagement survey where men and women had different ratings of agreement on it were the fact that everyone has equal opportunity. So I did a deep dive into that, for example. And so ultimately our overarching goal for our strategic business case is enhancing gender equity for women in the opportunities and experiences at all levels. So it's very broad, but it gets to kind of what we're seeing is a disconnect. And then once you kind of know what you're solving for, then you can kind of put some strategies in place, just like you would with a business plan, like a marketing business plan or a medical business plan. And maybe coming up with like 3 global strategies. And I think one thing that's really helped us at Gilead is to put weighting behind each of those strategies. So we have our strategic objectives, but there's a certain level of effort that goes, a relative effort that goes into each of those. So for example, 50% of our weighting for what we're going to focus on are things like mentoring, sponsorship, coaching for women so that we can make that progress. We have 30% dedicated to business impact. So that's kind of around what our ERG is doing for policies, for benefits for our members. We have a seat at the table with our benefits colleagues. And so while we don't own any of those decisions, we can be champions and voices for our ERG and gathering data in terms of what are people missing. I think determining metrics for success is one of the best things you can do. And that can be really challenging, right? If you've got, okay, we've got a number of members who, are thinking about leaving because we need better backup care or whatever that is, then you can go with that. And you've got a metric of whether that was successful or not. But when it's less tangible on the specifics, putting those metrics in place can sometimes be difficult, but you've got to start somewhere. And it can be things like, what proportion of your members of your ERG have mentors? What proportion of them are aware of the career development opportunities and resources available through your company? And so working to, it doesn't matter what the baseline is today. I think sometimes people are afraid to look at data because it may not be good. I think once you've got your baseline, then you look at improving it. So I think the other piece I'd say as well, as you're thinking about the building a business plan, just like you would if it was a business plan for one of a therapeutic area in a biotech or pharma company, for example, or any business plan, you're going to want to outline the rationale for any of your strategies and where the gaps or the opportunities are that are leading you to kind of make this an important strategy. I think the why and the rationale for kind of where your efforts are, I think is critical to all of this.
Great. Those are fantastic tips. And I hope this is recorded, so you will get the recording, but I hope people are taking notes because both Erica and Sharon, I think what you shared has been incredible. So let's switch gears a little bit away from the business plan, because another thing we talk about is the importance of influence mapping and really stakeholder buy-in. And we know that can be challenging. So once you've got your business case built, what does building an influence map tactically look like in reality? And Erica, I'll start with you, and then Annie would love to get your thoughts as well.
Sure. So it's interesting because I've done some of this in racial equity and impact investing work, and it's very similar here. And in addition to that situational analysis that Sharon mentioned, I think also power analysis is really important in this work as well. So understanding governance and decision making within context really matters. So to advance your cause, you're going to want to know which individuals or stakeholder groups, both internally and externally, are going to have the ear of primarily the C-suite, but also, some of the board members. You've got to consider the board of directors. Are there other influential executives? Are there key customer relationships or big investor groups that you can look to that are going to hold sway, or at the very least get the attention of the company, the corporation that you're operating in, and figure out what moves some of those key decision makers are going to respond to. So whether it's data driven, or is it going to be the stories and the testimonies that should be playing a role, personal testimonies that should be playing a role in some of that movement as well. So, are you operating in a space that likes to consider itself innovative and ahead of the curve? Or is it, more of one that wants to see evidence that industry leaders or other sectors even are already making movement on some of these opportunities as well? And so if you're going through those official channels, making sure that you're building the personal relationships around this work along the way. So one of the examples of how a company chose to sort of take a lead on this, and good, bad, or indifferent, the CEO of Bank of America was very frank at one point about the fact that he actually became an early and vocal champion for LGBTQ rights because his son was gay. And I think Bank of America continues to benefit from being ahead of the curve on that issue. So it's an example of how understanding some of the dynamics that are at play, again, whether or not it's going to be some more of the qualitative or the quantitative aspects that will move certain decision makers, understanding that context for how decisions are made. Is it, hey, we're innovative and we want to be ahead of the curve, or we're going to be sort of in lockstep with other peer industry groups and organizations or companies. Right? Like, so having a sense of all of those dynamics, but then also, again, where's the power and the influence in some of the decision making as well, I think are incredibly important to know where you're going to have resistance, because that's also important. Equally important is to know when resistance is going to come, where it's going to come from, and very often what the case is for some of that resistance, so that you can counter it as well.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. It goes back to, I was mentioning earlier that paid leave didn't become really important to me until I was ready to take paid leave. And a lot of the women that we talk to at Fairy God Boss say the same thing. If you ask, what's the paid leave policy in your company, and they've never had children at that company before, they may not know. And so I love that, finding those stakeholders who really have vested interest in the topics or the actions that you're looking for them to take. I think that's great advice. Annie, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only specifics I would add are, when we work with ERG leaders who are looking to advocate for an expanded paid leave policy within their companies, we always say, like, who's the decider? Do you know who the decider is? Like, you need to know whose decision it is at the end of the day in order to organize your campaign toward that person. It's usually a new paid leave program needs buy-in and sign off, if not whole decision-making authority, from an HR lead. That's usually where it lands. Sometimes straight to an executive team or a CEO. But usually, even if it's the CEO's final decision, an HR lead's blessing is necessary. So they're a decider along the way, if not the ultimate decider. When it comes to public policy, very tactically speaking, what we've found, especially this past year as the legislative process has heated up, is that for bigger companies that do engage with lobbying, you got to get into the government affairs department. And the work that happens within ERGs, within a CSR team is, again, important groundwork, but and if a company is going to be really serious about engaging on public policy, then that is going to need to happen through government affairs. So you got to get over there eventually.
Great. So Galvanize, which is Fairy God Boss's annual summit that really is intended to bring together the leaders of ERGs, key stakeholders, diversity and inclusion professionals, talent acquisition professionals, everybody who kind of has a stake in the game of advancing equity in the workplace. That happened last month, and Dr. May McDonald from Wharton talked about leveraging external advocacy groups and unexpected allies within the company as among the key things needed for success for employee activism. So Erica and Annie, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, and then Sharon, again, would love to get your kind of practical experience on how do these strategies benefit internal pushes for advocacy or policy change? And Erica, we'll start with you.
Sure. So last year we were successful in getting a Fortune 100 retailer to agree to do a nationwide audit just to identify barriers its employees were facing in accessing reproductive health care. So it's an example of if you think you'd like to have the support of investors, like, you can be in touch with our team, with our corporate engagement team, because we facilitate dialogue between institutional investors and company executives. about reproductive and maternal health care. Of course, we discourage political spending that's going to conflict with those priorities, and do encourage companies to take public policy stands. But we're part of a network of other shareholders who talk to companies about other issues like pay equity, racial equity, labor conditions, environmental issues. So like as an investor organization, it's important to know where some of the leverage is outside, yes, of the company, and that's what we exist to support. I think it's amazing and it's wonderful that Fairy Godboss is providing some of these opportunities for women's ERGs to learn from each other, learn from experts in the field, because you're right. It's very often someone's a volunteer and they're head down and they're in a space that they're maybe just trying to fight through to get, the ERG really established within an institution. So Sharon, you're in such an amazing position. I know, like we keep saying this over and over again, but I think that is the model where, that there is an investment in this work. So, everybody doesn't even know that that's a possibility out here. So I think this is another platform that can be helpful in doing some of this work as well. So.
Great. And then Sharon, anything to add, practically how you're incorporating, whether that's executive sponsorship, male ally involvement, different cross-functional or intersectional groups within Gilead?
Yeah, certainly at Gilead, each one of our ERGs has an executive sponsor. So we work really closely with our IND, Inclusion and Diversity group, but each of the ERGs has an executive sponsor at that C-suite level. We also have a quarterly IND council meeting with our CEO, Dan O'Day, along with his global leadership team and all the executive sponsors, where each ERG gets a few minutes to present to that team to say what have they worked on and what impact have they had. And I think that's key. I know we're going to get to questions in towards the end, but I think talking about what you do as an ERG is important, but talking about the impact of those actions is what's going to make people care about it, right? So I think that's a really important piece to this, and that also, get your executive sponsors even more bought in, right? If they can kind of talk about and understand the impact of the actions. That I think an easy trap for ERGs to fall into is to focus so much on the community, and I think that's a really, really important piece, is to kind of create this sense of community and engagement among women. But if that's where your primary focus is, you get viewed as a social club, a very successful social club, but not a group that has a business impact and can really influence anything. So I think that's one piece. And then on the male allyship, I think, we have a long way to go at Gilead with that. Ex-US, we're doing a really, really good job with male allyship, where, our chapters ex-US are including men in everything that they do. It's really a learning for everybody. We're not there in the US. And, partly because we need to do a big call to action is one of my next kind of pieces to get more men involved. I actually joined the Forte Inclusive Leadership conference over the last couple of weeks that's specifically focused on male allyship. And there was a really great but simple quote that came out of that, because one thing I hear from some of our members is, why are we trying to include more men? We don't need men to save us, or we don't need men to speak for us. But a really nice phrase is, certainly all the research is out there that if you include men in your initiatives, you're going to make more progress. There's some really great studies that show that. But also the quote of, we're not going to make progress if all we're doing is have women talk to women about women. So we have work to do to get to a really good point with male allyship at Gilead, or allyship for gender equity is what we're sort of transitioning the wording to, because we can all be allies for each other. And I think we're, the Fairy God Boss toolkit, I know there's links in the chat, are a great resource for some of this work as well.
Definitely. And it's interesting too, because I hear the same thing as we're talking to our users and ERG members of, why do we need men? But when you look at some of the most recent research, the Lean In McKinsey research that comes out each year, the farther along in the pipeline, the higher up you go, the smaller the percentage of women are there. So you need the people that are at the decision-making level to be involved in those conversations. I think that's great. And Sharon, I love the transparency too, because I know a lot of the individuals on this call are also struggling with making sure male allies are part of the conversation in an impactful way. Annie, anything additional to add on, what are strategies for internal pushes for advocacy and policy change for any of our members or any of our attendees?
I think in terms of strategy, this is sort of getting back to the previous question, or it's just sort of leveraging the resources that exist and looking for external partners. Plus, my goal is to win a federal paid leave program. And I think some of these ERG relationships have been very mutually beneficial. Yeah, I think so. Because the ERGs have certainly played a big role in developing the momentum to getting a federal program closer. And, the resources that Plus has are freely available for ERGs to use to, so they don't have to invent the wheel when creating their own internal paid leave program, or if they do want to prioritize paid leave as a priority for a policy push, use us. We create resources. There's no reason to keep that completely separate or for anyone to have to invent everything from the beginning. There can be a really great symbiotic relationship, and maybe it's not paid leave that's the big issue, but there's a number of advocacy organizations out there that I think would be very happy partners for ERGs looking to make change.
Great. And then Sharon, can you talk about how you've used external partners at Gilead to help create change?
Yeah, Fairy God Boss is a great example of that, the partnership that we have there. And on your website, we have Gilead profiled along with kind of the benefits of working at Gilead, really highlighting the reasons for somebody, from a recruiting standpoint, for somebody to join Gilead, but even for our internal employees, sometimes just using external partners to emphasize the benefits that Gilead gives and the reasons to, articles about our leaders. I think the other great thing with Fairy God Boss, for example, is, I've been able to connect with people in similar positions to myself, in different industries, not all in biotech or pharma, but just a lot of different industries, and learning about various resources, different tactics that have been used. You can post questions and get to that. Other external partners we've worked with, I think one of the things that we're working on doing is, almost using our partnership with Fairy God Boss as now the role model for how partnerships should work. Because with some external organizations, you do a sponsorship and your sponsorship gets you your logo on the conference webpage. Or, really, we're not about marketing our company. We're about getting visibility and making change. So we sort of changing how we work with I think external partners are critical. And it's a lot of content and really critical content that our external partners produce that we use for all of our members' benefits. But the more we can be part of that conversation and sort of influence some of the content to be relevant to our employees, the better. So we're trying to enhance a number of our partnerships that way.
Great. Okay, so before we go to the Q&A, because I see more questions coming in, is there anything not in the toolkit that you want ERG leaders to know as they are on their journeys to improve internal policies or engage their company in public policy advocacy, specifically about advancing gender equity or advancing any of the number of different topics we've talked about today? So Sharon, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Annie, and we'll end with Erica.
Sure. I think it's worth reiterating that a data-driven approach is key. I sound like a broken record here, but passionate voices are only going to carry so far. You can have all the passion and all the goodwill in the world, and you don't want to be seen as a nuisance or a bother if you don't have data to back it up. And once you start taking action and you get some buy-in, always framing up what you've done with an impact of those actions, I think is really critical as well.
Definitely. Annie?
I think that's right. I sign on to that. And I think this is probably in the toolkit, but I would reiterate just the power that ERGs have. There's such potential. ERGs can move mountains both internally within companies, which is not a small thing, and also the power that ERGs have to push companies to take public positions is not small potatoes. Great work, everyone who's doing it.
Erica?
Sure. So I think as you're on this journey, and you might hear from senior executives who say, I'm sympathetic, but my hands are tied, ask the question, what would it take to untie your hands? What conditions inside or outside the company would need to be changed or need to be met so that they feel sufficiently supported to take action. And if you're not able to actually effectuate those changes alone within the company, then turn to other organizations, as everyone has suggested here, to see what else can be done. So it is some of those external partnerships that are going to be useful for the learning, or for the strategizing on what to do next, or where to access some of that data that's going to be helpful in making the case. RIA Ventures is here to support this work as well. So we work with large institutional investors who can get meetings with management, or if you want to learn from us as well in terms of strategy, we're have our information actively out on the website and in the toolkit. So we're signing up as a resource to be helpful as well. So.
I love that. And Erica, I think that's a great transition actually into our first question from Nyla, who's asking, how do we advocate for ourselves and what we do as being leaders of an ERG to internal organization leadership? Most of our senior corporate level management does see this work as volunteer work or our passion project, and not actual work that can make an impact. So I think, to Erica's point, that's a great starting point, is figure out what needs to happen to untie your hands, but anything that anyone else would like to add to that?
I'll say at this point, that's unfortunately still a shared point of view, but it's unenlightened, because I think we've proven time and time again the value of ERGs, the value of ensuring that there are resources that are supporting the leadership as well as those groups as well. So, again, leaning on Fairy Godboss or other ERGs that might exist in the company to not, again, to sort of lift up. This is more than a social group. This is an important part of business, of shaping business culture, of affecting the bottom line, of shaping employee experience. The list goes on and on. So when that is the statement, I think it's important to, again, come back with data that just demonstrates that otherwise, and that is simply not the case. But Sharon, I defer to you as well on some of that.
Yeah, completely agree. I think framing up, again, just no matter what you do, if it's bringing in a motivational speaker, making sure that when you talk about what you did, you have an impact that you're also talking about. So maybe it's polling questions at the end of the talk if you've got a motivational speaker, or maybe it's, if you've been able to influence policies and benefits for your members, just keeping track, but always framing it up in terms of the impact so that at a corporate level, it's that whole what's in it for me and why should I care? Just like you're talking about any piece of your work that's your day job, and you're going to just talk about how many hours you put into a project, but what the impact of your work was. I'd say just bring that mindset to everything you do for your ERG as well.
Definitely. Annie, anything additional to add?
I don't think so. I think those are wise words.
Great. So Brittany's asking, how do you apply the ERG model to a smaller company? She works somewhere that has less than 20 people. So how can you still, advocate and make an effective platform in a smaller organization?
I can start here, Karen, because I think it ties nicely as well with Katie Cumber's question around making a brave space. When you've got a small group like that, you have to have a brave space. And maybe you don't need a specific women's ERG, or maybe you don't need a specific ERG for Black employees or Asian employees, but look at who you have and just have open discussions around the challenges that you face at work and try and educate each other. And I think the brave space that comes into this is be aware of how you react, right? If somebody asks a question or makes a statement that is either offensive or goes against everything you want, use it as an educational opportunity, not as an opportunity to correct them, just, in a different way. One of the things that I experienced in one of our focus groups that we've done, trying to kind of get at the root cause of some of the data that we'd seen. There were some men who joined the focus groups. I was thrilled to see it. And we had somebody say, I'm just curious, where's the ERG for white men? And, the tendency for people is to jump on that and start explaining why there's not one. And I think creating a brave space, and also in a small group of people where you probably have very diverse, so hopefully you have a very diverse group of 20 people, that you can start asking questions and, tell me about the challenges that you face. Tell me about, some people don't like the word microaggression. You can use the word subtle acts of exclusion. What is happening? I want to understand. And when you get faced with the question of like, why is there no ERG for white men, instead of sort of jumping on it, say, just even recognizing that was a really brave question to ask. Really glad you asked that, because I'm sure it's on people's minds. Let me explain why. So you're not sort of making someone feel bad, and you're almost recognizing someone for bringing up those tough questions. And I think the more we can do that, the more open people, I've led teams in the past where, and it outside of an ERG, but I think the same thing applies, is someone who's going to ask, I used to have a section in my team meetings called Elephants in the Room. And I would pre-populate with a couple of things I knew were on people's minds. And then I would give spot prizes to somebody who asked a really awkward, uncomfortable question for them. So to sort of reinforce that this is the brave space where you're not going to get attacked for a question that you ask. We're going to answer it very honestly, but we're also going to thank you and recognize you for asking the question. So couple of questions in one there, but hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I love that. And just really quickly, we have one more question before we wrap up, but I want to remind everyone, we did just launch a poll. As Jen mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be doing a series of these webinars. So we'd love to get your feedback as to what you'd like to see over the content for our next webinar. So you can visit the polling section on Zoom and answer that poll. So as we've got about a minute left, an anonymous attendee had submitted, how do you eradicate the stigma centered on having a women's network by title? We advocate for absolutely everyone. We promote open membership and inclusivity, but others may feel like they can't relate or identify. So why join in general? So especially as we're talking about allyship and inclusivity, Sharon, perhaps you can take that one as well.
Yeah, this is something that I've been spending a lot of time on, of kind of creating the almost what's in it for me for men, And through that conference I just attended as well, it was very clear there's a lot of data that since the Me Too movement, men are even more reluctant to get involved in one-on-one mentoring for women, going out for drinks to talk about career, and so how do we again create that safe space and get more men involved, and making sure that women aren't feeling like we're involving men because we need saving, and men aren't feeling like we're involving them as token males, but it's really about learning from each other and being advocates for gender equity and allies for gender equity. And it's not about male allies to help save the women. And, you know, it's a subtle change in the wording and framing up what's in it for me. And one of the things that I'm currently working on is what are the subtle acts of exclusion that women feel sometimes when they're maybe the only one in the room. But then on the flip side of it is what are the subtle acts of exclusion that men feel? Because we sometimes come across women who are male bashing, jokes about their husbands, and that wouldn't fly if it was men making jokes about their wives. So really creating an environment while Women at Gilead is going to continue to be a female ERG, we are working on right now some taglines around, you know, allyship and business impact, and really framing up within our mission and for all our new hire orientations why we need men to get involved and how it's beneficial for them, right? Coming back to that, what's in it for me from both an individual perspective, but also at a corporate level.
Definitely.
I know we're at time, but I would just add to that, and Sharon, I think you alluded to this a little bit, is being clear when a space is an affinity space versus an ally or awareness space. And it's really important to have that distinction because some of the conversation or even just the level of the dialogue is different. So when inviting people into a safe space, brave space, where they have the ability to ask questions, if we're having a, you know, graduate level dialogue, you know, having, you know, folks who are entering sort of at a high school level of understanding, it's not going to go well. And so being really clear about the purpose of a conversation or the purpose of a convening, I think is going to go a long way as well to helping people understand like where they can enter and how they can enter some of those spaces as well. So just wanted to add that as a, I guess, a little tactical approach to support some of that too.
Yes, definitely. Well, ladies, thank you so much for your time today. Annie, Erica, Sharon, it has been really a pleasure chatting with you. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining. Again, we will be sending out the recording as well as some of the resources that we have shared in the chat, and appreciate you all so much. And we will talk to you again soon.